would be acknowledged would be the menstrual cycle, which is something that we've given, quite a bit of lip service to in the past, but it's something that I think remains fairly poorly understood, both in terms of, well, firstly, like for an individual woman, like when does her cycle start? When does it end? What are the different phases? What are the implications of that? So for the individual woman, but then on average as well, like what's the general cycle length? So like we've gone over this before, but in summary, I guess, so the average cycle length, which is really important to just note that it's an average, it could be anywhere from plus or minus 20, if not more days, but we're talking about around 28 days. That's the kind
it's
of,
not even an average. It's actually just this make up.
yeah, it's like no one has this.
Like realistically, like if it is an average, that means that there's people out there having like 15-day cycles, which is just not happening. Like that might happen occasionally, but it's not happening regularly. So it's definitely not an average. It's definitely not a median. It's basically just a fucking made up.
An ideal. It's a textbook ideal. Okay, so the 28-day cycle, let's just go with it. Okay, first 14 days, very simply, is follicular phase. Second 14 days, luteal phase. Just think of it like that. Ovulation happens in the middle. Okay, that's the real simple breakdown. The first 4 to 7 days or so will be menses, or your period, within that follicular phase. So that's a very simple breakdown of the menstrual cycle. There's a number of different hormonal changes that take place during that time, and the important thing to understand here is that we're not just interested in the hormonal changes because they allow you to gain body fat or lose body fat or whatever, but rather that they impact your overall energy expenditure a little bit, and they impact, even more importantly, I think, your appetite. This is probably the biggest barrier that can arise, because the hormonal changes that take place throughout the cycle effectively lead to an increase in body temperature as you move along your cycle towards the end. And effectively what's happening there is you've got an increase in your metabolic rate. It's not a massive increase like plus 500 calories, but I think, if I recall correctly, you might see a change of up to 100 calories. Would that be around what you'd agree with?
I've seen, I think I saw on the research like 150 or something. And like a lot
Yeah.
of the stuff is like somewhat anecdotal because, someone is measured through like body temperature, and
Yeah.
some of it's like people get really uncomfortable while they're, in their last like 2 weeks of their cycle,
Mm-hmm.
or at least the last week anyway. And they're kind of like, fidgeting a bit more. They can't get comfy. So you are like, expending calories that way. And obviously this is hard to fully, hash out, because some people might be like, I'm actually just so uncomfortable that I actually stop burning as many calories, because they stop doing stuff like, going for a walk, or, doing other things. So it's very poorly, like clearly identified exactly, like this is the exact number. But this is something that's interesting, because like these are, and you probably get into it in a second, this is largely driven through like progesterone, right? And this is one of those things where it's interesting to think about it based on the fact that, like, the way people talk about different things, like people are like, oh no, you're going to go catabolic. People are like, oh, if you miss your protein feeding window, you're going to go catabolic, right? But then they'll go into a fat loss phase and they'll be like, oh, I need to jack up my caffeine intake, and I need to jack up my like fat loss stimulants or whatever intake. But all of that stuff is basically catabolic. Like, it's causing you to burn through energy with no net anabolism, no net gain in like, muscle tissue or whatever else. So it's like, it's interesting to note that when people say that, because you could very easily sell this fucking mastermind project or a program of being like, we're going to overcome the fact that you are more catabolic in the last 2 weeks of your cycle. You're going to come up with fucking whatever random program, be like, oh, we're going to increase your protein here, and we're going to like, increase calories or whatever else. And like, that is potentially a viable strategy. And we might get into that in a second. But it is interesting the way people talk without realizing that, again, like, just because like you are burning more calories during the latter half of your cycle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's better for fat loss.
Yeah, and like, this is the thing, is that like it's kind of attractive to look at the physiological changes that take place and then hypothesize about how you might implement nutrition accordingly. But I think the biggest thing, and this is the thing I end up talking to most of my female clients about, at least those who it's relevant for, and that's the changes in appetite and cravings that can occur towards the end of the cycle. I think this is something that's far more consistent than any observable change in performance or anything like that. I think they tend to be pretty subtle, but that's a big one, is the change in appetite. A lot of women that I work with tend to report subjectively increased appetite or more difficulty with adherence towards the end of their cycle. And to be honest, it's not even necessarily the case that people are always aware of it. It's sometimes the case that I point it out, because what will happen is, they'll come to a certain stage in their cycle and I have them list in our check-in document, what week they're on each time. And then they'll just say, oh, nutrition adherence wasn't great this week. Not really sure why, I was just had kind of cravings and stuff.
I was stressed.
Yeah, I just lost motivation, when in fact it's because of the stage of their cycle that they're at. And I think if you can tune into that, it does give you a certain level of empowerment, because one, you can give yourself a bit of a break and say, oh, it's actually not just that I'm not motivated or I'm not disciplined. There's actually some rationale here. And that can sometimes make it less stressful, and sometimes can even improve adherence just through the knowledge. But the other thing that it allows you to do is to say, okay, right, I understand that my appetite's up on this week. So each time this week comes around, what we can then do is give the person an extra 100 or 200 calories, let's say, or maybe plan one higher day or something along those lines. Not because we need to compensate for the metabolic changes, but rather just to facilitate those changes in appetite. And I think that's something that can be really, really useful, because what it means then is that the woman is going into her next cycle without the stress of having had a poor week or having been really hungry. Because that's the other thing, is even if you do stay on track during that period of time where you are more hungry, it might then carry into the next week where you're already kind of fatigued from having to, exert all this discipline, and you're already have a bit of hunger going into the week. Whereas if you've taken care of that, now it's a bit of a smoother transition. So that's something that I've had great success with. Now, I will say it's not something that all of my female clients will do. I think another important thing to note there as well is that that's also confounded to some degree by those who are on oral contraceptives or other modes of contraception. But that's something that we'll move on to as well.
Yeah, and this is an interesting thing, because like I even just had a client the other day. I think she's about 25, 26, something like that. And she was like, wow, I didn't realize how much more beneficial it is to have a regular cycle. Like before, first of all, she wasn't tracking it, and second of all, because of her dietary patterns, sleep, stress management, etc., it wasn't regular, right? So her, first of all, getting a regular cycle, again, this archetypical fucking whatever 4-week cycle, 28-day cycle, like we got a little bit closer to that. We're at like a 30-day cycle. So for her, it's like she actually has a lot more control over like planning ahead for stuff. Now, obviously, you can't be perfectly planned for this stuff, because it does whatever the fuck it wants to do. But it at least allows you to be like, right, I'm probably going to notice some things on this week, or I'm going to have to actually plan ahead for this week. It does give you a little bit more ability to plan ahead. But it is interesting as well, because you start noticing that, and this is something that I'm kind of excited for in terms of the research that will come out of this, that a lot of individuals that are in the, I'll call them whatever it is, Gen Z, is it? The next one, not us millennials, Gary, but the next generation, like a lot of them have grown up just tracking their cycle on apps. Like literally, I know girls that have literally had their cycle tracked on an app since they were like 13. So I think that's a lot more common, and it is a lot more like, imagine you had like you're 23 and you have 10 years of data of like, oh, this is what my cycle has looked like. This is what it like. This is what I was doing nutritionally. This is where I was in my life, et cetera, et cetera. And you just have all of that data. It's like, that's a treasure trove of data for you, So it's interesting to see that that's something that is coming to fruition in the next couple of years. When people are in their 20s, maybe they have a little bit more money to spend, and they're like, I want to get coaching, or potentially they're like, oh, I actually want to do something with this data. It is interesting that it's going to happen. But as you said, like, we can get really caught up in all these hormones, right? Now, obviously, the pill changes things, because that is effectively a supplemental or a pharmaceutical hormonal intervention. Potentially does change things, which we'll get to. But this is one of the things, and I want to make it really clear right now, that just because there are hormonal differences between men and women doesn't mean that those hormonal differences are actually going to inhibit fat loss. Because while Well, first of all, estrogen is actually really beneficial for fat loss, so that's fantastic. Like if you're a woman and you have more estrogen than a guy, fat loss is technically easier, right? You also have an easier time with a whole host of other things. And again, we've talked about them before. Progesterone now does technically make fat loss a little bit harder. And that's true with its actual mechanisms and stuff, but it also does make it a little bit easier as well, because you're actually able to burn more calories just by virtue of having a different part of your cycle, right? But it does come back to what Gary just said there, where it's like, okay, that might be the case. You might have these differences in calorie expenditure, basal metabolic rate, or whatever across your cycle. But realistically, the more important thing for you as an individual listening to this, or if you're coaching individuals, is the fact that hunger and potentially, your daily habits are going to change across your cycle, right? And if you, again, like Gary said, if you have a cycle and you're like, all right, I know on week 4, for example, you just feel fucking hungry. Whatever you do, you just can't satisfy that hunger, like you have to account for that in a fat loss phase. Like, don't set yourself up for the shittest time ever, the worst experience dieting. If you're like, right, I'm going to try eat at a 500 calorie deficit. And even though I know, even when I'm eating at maintenance, it's hard for me to stick within these calories, during this last week. Again, it's different for everyone, but whatever it is for you, maybe it's the last 3 days, whatever, right? If you're like, even at maintenance, it's hard for me to stick to the calories. Like if you think you're going to eat at a 500 calorie deficit on top of that, it's not going to happen. So don't shoot yourself in the foot going forward and being like, oh, my diet's a failure because every 4 weeks, I basically, overeat. Like, don't set yourself up for that failure. Actually account for it in your, we'll call it nutritional periodization, which is a great pun or play on words. But account for it, and that's something that I've done with a lot of my female clients. Obviously, for some individuals, it doesn't need to be done. Some people are literally just fucking machines, and they're just like, give me the exact same calories throughout. Don't need to change anything. I just literally stick to them, So it's like, for some people, you're going to need to account for it. It can make fat loss harder by virtue of the fact that it changes your habits and obviously changes your appetite potentially. So it makes actually sticking to the diet harder. And as everyone knows, hopefully, that listens to this podcast, they know that adherence is the most important thing. Like, again, we can get caught up and we can get lost in all of the little nuances of like this physiological or biochemical or fucking whatever process. It's actually irrelevant if you're not actually able to adhere to the plan. And unfortunately, the menstrual cycle potentially makes it hard to adhere to the plan. And this is where, again, the issue lies. It's not the actual hormones. Like, obviously, these changes are driven by hormones, right? But it's not the actual hormones being like, oh, progesterone makes it harder for fat loss, estrogen makes it easier or harder, or whatever you want to make up a theory about. That's all great. All of that biochemical analysis and all that biochemical explanation is great. It all pales in comparison to the fact that it just makes adherence harder. So that's the thing we need to focus on.
Yeah, and I suppose like one final kind of menstrual cycle variable that may not be obvious but is not worth forgetting is the fact that because of menstrual bleeding, there's also a higher risk of anemia in women as well, which may not seem like it's directly attached to the fat loss discussion, but we have had a number of women over the years who have gone to the doctors and realized that the cause of this persistent fatigue was actually the heavy menstrual bleeding and subsequent anemia. And if you're super fatigued with anemia or fatigued from another condition, you'll know that it can be very difficult to get to the gym, to put in your best effort, to get out and do your steps and stay active. So that's certainly something that can play into the discussion again. So again, just another barrier, I guess, that can be present. And I suppose one thing as well to note is that like a barrier to fat loss, and this is something we plan to discuss in this, is not being able to pursue fat loss because of the absence of your menstrual cycle, or the absence of a regular menstrual cycle, I should say. And that's effectively something that men are typically not as sensitive to low energy availability as women are. Okay. And that obviously makes sense given the role of women as bearing children. And effectively what can happen is if someone is amenorrheic, they don't have their period, then the difficult thing there is that can be the result of low energy availability. And that person may still be overweight or fatter than they would like to be, and they'd like to be leaner. But the difficult thing then is trying to pursue fat loss in the presence of that in a smart way. Now, it can be done, absolutely. You know, a smart approach, getting someone's energy availability up, addressing stressors and other variables. But most of the time, for women addressing that on their own, they might just have to give up their fat loss pursuits because of those physiological changes. Difficult thing to overcome that I don't think men are as they can deal with it for sure. Obviously, not the loss of menstrual cycle, but other symptoms, but just less likely to run into those problems.
100%. And again, we've talked about this before on the podcast. I think we did literally a podcast on
Just a few weeks ago.
So that was only a few weeks ago. So as Gary was talking about, like, go back and listen to that podcast, because we did discuss quite a bit in there. But it is something to be aware of, especially if you are a woman who has potentially lost her menstrual cycle by virtue of dieting to try get some fat loss. It's like, this might not be the most beneficial thing for you overall. Now, the unfortunate thing is, for some individuals, they are just really, really sensitive to this occurring. And it's just a foregone conclusion that to lose fat, they are going to have to experience some sort of amenorrhea, or at least changes to the menstrual cycle. Now, that's fine, at least in my eyes. Obviously, this is a discussion you have to have with the individual, but at least in my eyes, I'm like, that's actually okay for, it happens a month, 2 months. If we start getting into 3 months, I'm like, okay, this is actually a pretty big issue. If we're getting to 6 months, it's like we have to start dealing with this a little bit more. Now, for some individuals, again, it's a no factor. It's like they're aware of the trade-offs, they're aware of all the risk, bone density, osteoporosis in later life, etc. And they're like, okay, I'm actually okay with this. But for some individuals, they're not okay with those risks, and they might be okay with just chasing fat loss for the next 2 months. But if they continue to have menstrual irregularities, we're just going to have to increase calories and get that low energy availability sorted, So it is a very nuanced conversation that you have to have with the individual, or with yourself if you are trying to coach yourself, you're trying to look for fat loss yourself. But it is definitely something I wouldn't just ignore. I wouldn't just be like, it's fine. I'll deal with that when I'm later in life. But unfortunately, you can't deal with it when you're later in life, because your bones have demineralized, And just going back to that, talking about anemia as well, this is also a really interesting thing as well, where, like, you think, again, it's just anemia, it's just a bit of like fatigue or whatever. But think about, like, if it's iron, and iron is literally bringing oxygen, well, it's not hemoglobin, is bringing oxygen around your body, that also means to your brain. So you're not actually even thinking at your best when you have anemia, And again, that goes back to the adherence side of things, because if you're not thinking at your best, you're not able to, remain logical, rational, and, objectively look at the data and information in front of you. Do you think you're going to adhere to your diet? Probably fucking not. If you're sitting there and you're like, oh, literally so fatigued, so tired, and you're like, oh, well, I'm just gonna, grab a chocolate bar or do whatever and try to get, this fatigue sorted. I'm like, it just makes dieting harder. It just makes fat loss harder. And while obviously there's a huge health complications from having anemia, it just makes, as we're just talking about here, it makes the fat loss goal a lot harder to achieve. So you need to address that before ever considering fat loss, right? And unfortunately, it is the case where people will engage in a fat loss diet, and as a result of that, they will pull out potential iron sources from their diet, such as red meat, because they're like, oh, well, it has about a few more calories from fat or whatever, so I'm not going to eat red meat. Women generally, again, especially in like our kind of culture, this kind of Anglosphere, they generally shy away from red meat. They generally tend to go towards, chicken and stuff like that. And so that can already be a barrier if you start pulling out more red meat sources, because that's generally your kind of best source for iron in the diet. And if you try pulling out more of that because you're in a fat loss phase, bad things are going to happen,